Thank you all for coming. This is the final first Thursday presentation of our off season because the museum will be reopening on excuse me on May 3rd, and we'll actually have a members only preview the night before that most of the folks here are going to be invited to as members. Um, and we have an awful lot of new exhibits and interesting developments that have occurred this off season, and we want to tell you about some of them tonight. That's the subject of tonight's program. I will ask that you mute yourself. We're going to have a gaggle of presenters, and after each presenter, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, and you can unmute then. But especially with a large crowd of presenters, it gets pretty confusing if a lot of people are unmuted and chatting among themselves and sneezing and TVs on, that sort of thing. So we'll begin with a really interesting development that took place over this off season, and the chairman of the museum board, Randy Miller, is going to talk about that. And I'm going to go to my slide presentation here so that Randy can speak on it. Randy, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. As Nick said, my name is Randy Miller. What I'm going to talk about is what I think is one of the most iconic items we've acquired this year. This is a fire pumper wagon that was originally bought by the city of Buchanan in 1863. Apparently, there was a major fire in Buchanan's downtown area in 1862, which prompted the purchase of this. Now, 1863 was also the year that Abraham Lincoln was president and the Battle of Gettysburg was raging on. So it's a pretty old piece of equipment. Now, if we could go to the next image, this is what I believe to be the fire crew of that fire pumper wagon. And to their right, you see the giant hose reel, which we've also acquired. That's probably in front of their fire station, I'm assuming. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, this one here is an article, as you can see, that was in the Berrien County Record in April of 1926. I think there's a mix up in the dates there. I don't believe it served for 60 years prior to 1895. I think it was 30 years. But it did find its way to Chicago to help fight the Chicago fire, according to this article. But that fire again was in 1871.
Might be
So
60
that's,
years prior. Might be 60 years prior to the 1926 article. Maybe that's how they.
well, they say prior to 1895, whatever it might be. So that's an interesting article. Gives us a little more history on the wagon. So let's go to the next one. Okay, this is the fire pumper wagon as it was displayed in the Chamberlain Museum in Three Oaks after they acquired it, I believe in 1921. That's kind of when the museum opened. And if you look at the picture, you can see how low the ceiling is there. So I'm thinking it was in the basement of the building, although I don't see a way to enter and exit the basement, but it looks to be in the basement of the building. And I can't tell if that's a real guy standing there or not. It looks like a real guy, but maybe it's not. Okay, let's go on, Nick. This is where the pumper wagon was stored underneath the football stadium at Michigan State University
Now, this
in
is
the midst of,
after the museum folds, the original Chamberlain Museum, right? Right.
right, it folded in 52. Everything was sent to Michigan State University. This is the area it was stored in with other very large artifacts that we'll be looking at as well in a few moments. Okay. Now, this is the fire wagon. The Michigan State allowed Buchanan to borrow it on a couple occasions, and they had it in this parade, which we think was, I think, 1954, if I'm not mistaken. So they had it on a cart, exhibited it in their parade, and then they had obviously had to give it back to Michigan State. Okay. Now, these are two of our other acquisitions. The one on the left, that's guys unloading it, is the Studebaker Brougham carriage. It's a very high end carriage from about 1890. And we know it's a Studebaker because it has some kind of writing underneath one of the seats related to Studebaker. On the right is the original hearse, or one of the original hearses from Three Oaks, which I believe dates to in the 1880s. Is that correct, Nick?
Yeah, probably 1890s, I would guess. Yeah.
1880s, 1890s. And there's a possibility that people like Henry Chamberlain rode in that thing too. So we have both of them sitting in our building. So let's go on. Okay, there's the pumper wagon again. That's the first picture we looked at. And again, that's the fire crew. These are both pictures we already looked at. Is that all we got? Oh no,
Well,
okay.
I mean,
Right, okay.
the point, let me just say, the reason that we're getting those wagons back and that this pumper is available is that Michigan State has reclaimed the storage space and they're going to make more football related stuff out of it. So they were getting rid of some of those large items. And that's
Right.
why they're available to come back.
Okay, now we've contacted the city of Buchanan because the board of directors of the museum met and we wanted to give them the opportunity perhaps to borrow it and display it as long as they had a secure, safe facility to put it in. And they were very excited about that. And they agreed in principle, and we're still in negotiations with them. But this is Wesner Automotive on Redbud Trail, where they want to store this temporarily and exhibit it. It's a secure building as far as we know. I think it has sprinkler systems, and they're obviously going to have it well insured, and we will still retain ownership of it. So it'll be basically a sign saying on loan from the region of Three Oaks Museum to the city of Buchanan. So and we got one more picture of that. I think there's the close up. There's a vehicle in there right now that looks like a pickup truck, and nobody will be allowed in this facility unless it's staffed. So nobody's going to be able to mess around with this fire truck or fire wagon, as I should say. So within another month or so, we should be able to bring it back from MSU. It's still sitting in MSU until we have it insured, as well as all the other materials we have in the museum. We're in the middle of negotiating a large insurance policy for everything. So give it another month and we should have everything. So that's that. And
Mhm.
that's it for me.
And I think when it does make its way from Lansing to Buchanan, which we hope will happen in the next couple of months, again, museum members will be invited to come see it at this Wesner Automotive place. But it's nice that it's coming back to the area. It's just been sitting under the football stands for decades, and Buchanan will have a chance to have a piece of its history there. Although, again, as you said, Randy, we will retain physical ownership of
Right.
it.
And we can get it back whenever we want it if there's some kind of issue that comes up. So
Mhm. Sorry,
okay, any questions?
yeah. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute. Um, and if I hear none, I'm gonna talk a little bit about the next exhibit, which is we have a new exhibit. Thanks, Randy, by the way. Randy and I actually worked together putting together a new exhibit on World War II. This is the 80th anniversary this year of some really major events in World War II. As you might know, D-Day is the anniversary of D-Day is in June. The anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge will be in December. Um, so this is timely, and our exhibit focuses on how Three Oaks reacted to World War II, but also some of the stories of local veterans, almost all of whom have left us. There is one living World War II veteran, I believe, and his story will be in the exhibit, although we have another story to talk to you about tonight. And the story we're going to talk about is Ted Sizer of Harbert, and Jack Sizer is with us to talk about that. And Jack, you can place these people who are on the screen and also tell us how you're related to them first, okay? Oh, you got to unmute, Jack. I need you to unmute your mic.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
You hear me now? Okay. Thank you. I'm Jack Sizer. And the picture in the upper left is the picture of my two uncles and my grandparents. This is on the left is Stuart Sizer. On the right is Uncle Ted Sizer. And sitting above them are my grandfather, their parents, Earl Sizer and Lillian Sizer of Birchwood Beach near Harbert. The other picture is simply a close-up of the same, the two guys again, Stuart on the left and Ted on the right. They are, I think, from that piano and from what I saw in the other parts of the picture, I think this is at a relative's home in Chicago. It's probably where they were able to get together for a picture because it appears that they're still in the service. I don't know that exactly. So that's who they are.
We have a great picture of Ted here. He's holding a movie camera. So and that played a role in his Army service. Can you kind of describe his background and how he wound up taking film for the Army?
Yes. Ted, during the 1930s, had a job as a photographer and for the Ford Motor Company. He had gotten that job through an advertising agency in Detroit. And so he became their Ford Motor Company's photographer for that agency. And throughout the 30s, he had gone to a college and then had this job driving back and forth from Detroit to Harbert, so on every week. But when World War II came about, Ted happened to be out in California. He'd followed a friend out there and was working part-time when when Pearl Harbor came along. Ted knew he was going to would be asked to serve. So he went ahead and joined the Army. And Ted was born in 1910, which means that he would have been 31 years old at this time, which made him a little older than most of the guys who were in his group. And therefore, I think mostly because of his many years of experience as a photographer and videographer, cameraman, he's working with guys who were between 17 and 20 probably at that time. Here's a picture of them. I don't know whether this is at Camp Crowder or it's later over in Europe, but that's Ted in the middle. They made him a tech sergeant very quickly because of his position. Maybe he just simply had to have that to run this group. I don't know. The name of the group was the 166th Signal Corps, which is basically a photographic unit that was in World War II at the time, and had quite a few wonderful experiences over there.
So at some point you do, or somebody in your family does an interview with Ted about his wartime experiences. I'm about to play a clip of that, but can you speak about when his reminiscences were recorded?
Yes, the reminiscences were from 1979. He had not wanted to talk about the war when he first got back, but by 1979 he was talking about things generally, and he agreed to do an interview with me, which is where this audio comes from those tapes. And
so yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, that's all.
Okay, I'm gonna play the clip. There are subtitles because sometimes audio doesn't come through really well on Zoom, but
okay.
I think you'll be able to make this out.
Okay.
It was the Second French Army Division, and so we were spearheading a lot of the action.
Then the tanks drove right in. Paris was free.
We were the first people into Paris, and it was quite a battle getting in there. Actually, there were a great many collaborators. There were a lot of French who collaborated with the Germans, and they didn't want to give up. The Germans gave up, but the collaborators didn't. So there was a great deal of fighting in the streets. And one of the most dramatic incidents was when we thought we were going to film the arrival of de Gaulle and all of the French marching in to take the city. So we filmed it, and we were Notre Dame Cathedral. All of a sudden, the man collaborator who was up in the tower began to shoot down at de Gaulle in the square in front of the cathedral. Turned and walked into the church, and then they began to shoot him at him from the towers inside the church, and he walked down the wall by himself, and the audience was pressing up against the walls, and and screaming and yelling, and the Te Deum was being sung in the background. It was an extremely dramatic time.
So those are the reminiscences again of Ted Sizer. I'm so glad that was recorded, Jack. So he goes from the liberation of Paris, and you have some push pins in this map that kind of shows some of his travels after that. But can you generally describe it?
Yes, if you look at that map there, we started up in the where those several pins are on the far left, coming out of Paris, and then into places like eventually up to the Battle of the Bulge that winter up in the far left. Later on, we come over to to the right, and you see a note that says Ted at Buchenwald. Apparently, Buchenwald was the first prison camp that Ted's group went into, and they were not aware that these things existed. This is a common thing most of us have heard, that the everyday soldiers, had no idea that these things even existed. And when the American troops got there, he proceeded from there, after taking pictures at Buchenwald, proceeded down, as you see, through Czechoslovakia and down to where it says Ted at Ebensee, just at the lower right of that picture, where it says Austria and Salzburg. Took some pictures there, which you'll see in a minute. One picture there. Later, of course, he goes more to the west. They went more to the west. There's the picture of Ted. It's the only picture that I took, which incidentally I got by Googling, and finally I found that there was a picture of him that some other guy who had sent pictures to the American Holocaust Museum, and popped Ted's name, and I was able to get a copy of this free of charge from the museum, Holocaust Museum, and I'm just thrilled to have it, even though it's what it is. Ted is standing up there looking at prisoners. This particular place was one where these prisoners were all women. They were assigned to go there because they were good at sewing and were sewing silk for parachutes and so on. But after Ebensee, after this particular area, that's when they headed west more toward Dachau. And again, Ted's group was the first group into Dachau prison camp, which is the one he told me the most about and how terrible it was.
And we have another audio clip, that, again, recorded decades ago, but it talks about his experience documenting the liberation of the Buchenwald camp. So let's listen to that now.
We're told to go to this little village of Buchenwald, and there, as we approached, why, we got this terrible smell. And then we went in, and here all these people were just starving to death and dying right before your eyes. And they told us horrible stories. And I shot a lot of pictures, but it was so awful, and that I didn't really want to send them in. I held them out, and then finally I sent the pictures in, and a colonel came down right away and said that this was very important material, and that if I saw any more concentration camps, to be sure and cover as much as I could. When we got into Buchenwald, Dachau rather, I took all the pictures in Dachau, and later on there was another one called Ebensee, which was in Austria, which I covered very heavily. But it was a very grisly experience. The thing that appalled me was how savage these people had been to each other. Not only the guards had been bad on them, but they also had been reduced to almost animals, in which they told on each other, and the whole thing. And it was just an incredibly awful experience, and it was one that had a tremendous impression on me. I never read or see any war movies if I can avoid it, because of the impression that it had on me during the war years. I had some wonderful letters from Carl Sandburg, and so I began to think about Birchwood a great deal. When you're in the Army like that and you have terrible experiences, you think about when you can get out and where you can go and where it will be safe. And so when I got through with the war, I headed straight for Birchwood.
So we heard a little about his coming back and talking with Carl Sandburg. Here's one of the letters that Sandburg wrote him. Maybe you can describe it a little bit more, Jack.
Yes, as you see, this letter was written just before the end of the war, virtually just 2 months before the war was over, or 1 month. where he writes to Ted, Carl Sandburg writes to Ted that he's comparing Ted to, as he says, you are in the tradition of Matthew Brady we talked about, with that war could not be delivered in those later generations without so vividly. The photographic record you are making will be treasured. Others like myself count on the days when we will have many hours of looking at them. And then he goes down to say at the very end, he says, so we know that you can't talk about what you've been doing really in detail, that sometimes you have to sleep on the dark, the hard side of a hard plank of the ground or worse. And we know that you'll be pleased to see you when you can finally arrive home.
And he has sort of a continuing relationship with Sandburg then, is that correct?
Exactly. Ted came home. Ted worked for Life magazine briefly, doing some film correspondence or film critiquing for a while. But then he came back to Birchwood and was here for a while. Was working, finishing up a degree, and also about the same time getting a job as to start a drama department at Olivet College in Michigan, Olivet, Michigan. But he had a relationship with Carl Sandburg, because the Sandburgs live only about 100. The Sandburg home was only about 100 yards away from my grandparents, where Ted stayed with them and where Ted was living at this time. And so he saw Carl Sandburg all the time. In fact, my grandparents in Sandburgs, because it was a resort area, the Sandburgs and my grandparents, Earl and Lillian Sizer, were the only people there in the wintertime. In fact, Carl Sandburg would come over and babysit with me when I was a little kid. But anyway, during this time, Sandburg would often turn down. He was getting older, of course. You can see him here. He's probably in his 70s by that time. And but because he had Ted there, he began to accept more of these speaking engagements to Rotary clubs and that kind of thing, literary guilds around the state or Indiana. And he would go and tell stories about Abraham Lincoln. Of course, he'd written the famous Lincoln, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Lincoln biography in 1936, I believe it was. But he would go and sing songs from another famous book that he had that he put together, which was called The American Song Bag. It's still one of the best collections of American folk songs ever. And Carl would go along and sing, and then Ted would do the driving, and they would go wherever, and Ted would go along with them, and they would talk constantly. But Ted said he was the only one who really wanted to talk about the war after the war. Everybody else thought they'd been through such terrible times because of rationing and all that stuff, but didn't really want to talk about it. They wanted to get on with their lives because the war was over. It was very upsetting to Ted because he felt like nobody wanted to talk with him, kind of like some of us know about people who went that same experience in the Vietnam War.
Yeah. And you said that he later went on. We have a couple of shots of Ted in his role as a drama professor, I guess, at Olivet.
Correct. This is a picture that was taken down in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where he became the director of the Fort Wayne Civic Theater, and did that for many years. The picture on the right is him directing or setup shot. The other picture is a picture of him, and I think he told me that he's standing there holding a pipe and talking as an actor. And I believe he was the what's the name of the character in our town, who was the stage manager, I think, stage manager, right?
Yeah, the narrator.
He kind of tells the story of our town, and this is Ted in that role. Yes.
And he did eventually go to some of the reunions, and this is a shot. When was this taken, Jack?
Golly, this would have been in the Ted died I think in about 97. I'm guessing this would have been shot maybe in the early 90s, just a guess.
And tell us about the guy who's sitting to his right.
Yeah.
Story about him.
Ted, as I said before, Ted taught a lot of these young men how to photograph, how to take a picture, how to develop film, how to change a camera, how to set up a movie shot, photograph. The man just to Ted's right in this picture, left in this picture, in the gray suit, in the very middle, is named Russ Meyer. Now, Russ Meyer, as soon as the war was over, went out to Hollywood, took all of his knowledge of movie and picture making, and went out and began to make soft porn movies out in Hollywood. In fact, wanted Ted to come out and help him to make these movies because Ted knew so much about movie making. but Ted didn't want any part of that, and Russ became kind of a minor legend out in the Hollywood community as a king of the soft porn industry out there. It's kind of funny sidelight, I thought.
Different people did different thing with their Army experience.
Absolutely.
So again, we'll open it up for any questions anybody might have.
Sure.
Again, we have the stories of many local veterans, but this is really one of the more dramatic ones, I think, and particularly because you have Ted describing the experience.
All right.
Any questions? All right. Well, in that case, Jack, thank you so much. Appreciate your sharing that
Thank you.
And digging through your attic to find those audio clips of your uncle.
Yeah. I think you did a great job of putting together all that not Google, but Facebook stuff or wherever you got them. Not Facebook, but the clips that you found and organizing them with the video and all that other stuff. Great job.
To make clear, I have no idea whether Ted Sizer shot any of the.
Oh no! I don't either.
Probably not, but at
nobody
least
knows that. Because if you were in the army photographing, you were just nobody knew who you were.
Right. Anyway, thank you again.
Yeah, you bet.
I'm going to move on to the next exhibit, which is 100 Years of Hats. And our collections chair, Judy Jackson, and her friend Sue Harsh had an idea for this exhibit. And they talked about it a little bit at the Volunteer Appreciation Dinner the museum held in December. And one of our volunteers, Linda Fredrickson, stepped up and said, she really pitched in. And Linda, you claim you're not an expert, but I talked to you the other day about hats and I learned a lot. So how would you describe your interest in hats?
I've been an avid collector for over 50 years. I, at one time, had a very extensive personal collection, which I've now gotten rid of about half of it, but just a passion of mine. So I'm not an expert. I'm just a passionate collector. I was very excited that Judy and Sue asked me to help in putting the exhibit together. So, I called tonight's presentation 100 Years of Hats because quite honestly, this is really a treasure of an exhibit because it does have millinery from 1880 to 1980 that will be displayed for this season. So it's really nice. As a beginning, I just kind of did a millinery introduction that, head coverings have been worn in cultures for centuries. It's, whether it was as a symbol of their wealth or a rank in society, many times they had to do with their religious connections and resources available is what typically millinery were constructed from, whether it's velvet, taffeta, animal hide, feathers. They would be adorned with jewels and ribbons. And although they've been around forever and ever through transformational periods, hats remained an important fashion accessory for both men and women. And what you will see in this exhibit this year is a real array of how that fashion accessory has touched the people around us. I made one other little minor note that especially in women's millinery, if you wore a hat up until the 60s, you typically wore gloves with them. So the exhibit this year, that even though it's a millinery exhibit, it does have gloves in it as well that are part of the museum's collection. So that should be 1880 to 1900, but the biggest change at that time was that if you think of Gone with the Wind in the middle of the 19th century, big old sunbonnets, and they were still popular by this time, but all of a sudden brims got smaller, hats became very utilitarian for the general person. But the biggest thing is the style soared, and they went super high, like the picture you see here. They were called flower pots or 3 stories. Then when we moved into the 1900s to 1920s, the first 10 years was the Edwardian era, and you see by this example here, really wide brims. They had lots of plumes and flowers and tulle. But by the 20s, all of a sudden you're into the Jazz age, and it was the most significant change both in women's fashion as well as millinery. Gone were the corsets, much to, Featherbones wasn't too happy about it, but all of a sudden apparel was looser, hair was shorter, and the cloche was the biggest, most significant change in headwear. It was bell-shaped, hug the head, brimless, and then Art Deco influence brought the popularity of the turban about the same time in the 20s. And we have some really nice pieces that reflect this in the exhibit. The 30s and 40s were post World War I. You know, they were military in their styling. They were unstructured and flat. The tam hat became popular. There's a really nice tam hat that's in the display. I mentioned here that this is actually when the pillbox style was introduced, and many of them were veiled, but it really didn't gain popularity until later. What was brand new were curvettes and fascinators. The exhibit here this year has some beautiful curvettes that, you know, they were very, very popular. They were almost like a little wrap on the top of the head, and they were adorned with nets and styles. After the war, you saw a lot more color and jeweling and feathers. It is the time Jackie Kennedy's signature accessory was the pillbox hat, and everyone wanted to emulate her. And at this time, hats were still a major wardrobe necessity, along with gloves during this period. Unfortunately, as we moved into the 70s and 80s, there was a wane in popularity, and women no longer wore hats daily. The formal styles gave way to fun expressions like, you know, cowboy hats. When you think of urban cowboy and what an influence it had on women's fashion, women's cowboy hats that weren't, you know, utilitarian, meaning they didn't work out on a ranch, they wore it for fun. It's also when the introduction of baseball caps and buckets, you know, floppy hats you see here. The hippie movement made floppy hats with wavy brims. They were all the rage. And there's a really nice collection of hats from the 70s to the 80s that is in this year's exhibit as well. The men's hats, interesting for the men, from 1880 to 1980, there were always hats of popular style. And other than the top hat, most continued to stay in style until the 60s. This actually, Nick, did you say this was Warren himself in this hat picture here?
P.K. Warren on the left, yes.
And he is wearing a top hat. You rarely see these, and there are two just exquisite pieces that are in this exhibit. They are really amazing. There's also a bowler that's in the exhibit for men, really nice one. They're very popular. I mean, I was telling Nick, I love the movies, and a lot of the movies I follow, you know, you'd see the millinery transitions, and in the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Paul Newman makes the bowler, which is also called the derby, made it, you know, very prevalent. It was his favorite hat at the time.
Nick Paul Newman can make any hat cool, right?
Oh, exactly. Then other popular styles, we'll go to the next slide. Yeah, the flat cap, it's still popular today in golf and other sports, but it was called the working man's hat. It was one of the first unstructured hats for men. I think the most popular for men in all the decades was the fedora. It's also called the trilby, but most often known as the fedora, and its trademark is its 3-inch brim. It was truly the most popular men's hat from the 20s to the 50s. The boater, the interesting thing about the boater, it was known as the skimmer, very popular in colleges. The ribbon band on them would be the school colors, and that's how you would know. The Panama, I was telling Nick yesterday, the Panama actually has two different types of tops. The rounded top, which is much like the old safari hat, is not pictured here. What's pictured here is the flat top. In the exhibit for this year, we have a nice straw hat that is similar in style to the Panama. The pork pie is similar to a fedora and a bowl. It's like a fedora and a bowler combined. It has the rolled up rim like you see in this picture, but it has a flat top. And then the walking hat, it's unstructured. It's usually crowned. It was introduced in plaids and checked. So, you know, men's hats, again, they, you know, styles have been around. It was really a personal choice. And other than the top hat, all the other styles stayed popular. Cowboy hat, worn for a couple hundred years. It continues to be in style. The baseball cap, right now, in the 80s, it crossed from sports equipment to a fashion accessory, and now it is probably the most commonly worn hat for men and women that is not for a formal affair. Really, truly, nowadays, the only formal wear and hats is by women in like the Kentucky Derby. I wanted to mention the millinery carriers because there are several in this year's exhibit, and they are really, really genuine. I mean, boxes were as stylish as the hats they carried. You know, if you were walking down the street with, you know, a Saks Fifth Avenue hat box, or there's a really beautiful Dobbs hat box that's octagonal that's in the exhibit. The styles, they really varied. They could be round, square, oblong, rectangular, all kinds. And they were typically for just daily storage, like a cardboard in nature. But this exhibit has two of the most exquisite travel cases. One predates the 1900s. It literally is a top hat carry, and it looks like it could have been on the back of a stagecoach for travel across the country. The other one that's pictured here on the right is very much constructed like a travel trunk and was most likely used for train or steamship travel. And it's, I mean, in wonderful condition, and is really just a unique piece for the exhibit this year. Kind of my closing comments, as much as hats have waned in popularity in the United States, which makes me sad personally, they never really have waned in popularity in Britain. And it was most likely due to Queen Elizabeth's long reign. I mean, she had such a fondness for head coverings, and she was just exquisite. Everything matched, from her hat to her coat to her dress to her bag. And I did, in a little research, I found that every day, Ladies' Day at the Royal Ascot Derby is in Britain considered the Oscars for original hat design. And it's when they all come out, and we have a little bit similar with the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness and other equestrian events, but nothing like Britain. And fascinators remain a popular substitute even today. I mean, just about any woman who wears something formally, it's going to be a fascinator, often before a brimmed hat. Mm-hmm. So really, that was my overview. I hope you all enjoyed the exhibit as much as I have. It's just really remarkable that the museum was able to put together a 100-year history for both men and women for this year's exhibit.
Well, thanks to you again, Linda, for your help with that exhibit. I know you helped out Sue and Judy greatly in kind of putting things in context. Take questions if anybody has them. By the way, I apologized if you heard barking a moment ago, but my dog saw a deer, and that's always cause for a comment. So, all right. Thank you, Linda. I don't hear.
You're welcome.
I want to move on to the next exhibit. Is our resorts exhibit now has a section about summer camps, including one that is celebrating its 100th anniversary, the Tower Hill Camp in Sawyer. And as with so many local historical events, Tower Hill's beginning has a tie to E.K. Warren, the aforementioned Three Oaks industrialist. And Reverend Tracy Heilman, the Tower Hill Camp's director, is here to fill us in on camp history. So, Tracy, if you would unmute and just tell us kind of how E.K. Warren leads to Tower Hill Camp, I guess.
Exactly. Thanks for inviting me. Yeah, I mean, we all know the history of E.K. Warren and coming up with using turkey feathers for the corsets and stays. We still have lots of wild turkeys here at Tower Hill, and we always kind of give a little bow and a thanks to them because in 1923, E.K. Warren gave about 60 acres of land here in Sawyer, gave it to the Congregational churches in the Chicago area, gave them to us to be used as a summer camp.
I'm sorry, I'm going to go to these shots are of
the pandemic.
Well, the summer camp movement, though, kind of has its roots somewhat in the pandemic and somewhat in the sort of urban slums that became very commonplace. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I think particularly about the pandemic because up until it happened to us, I thought the pandemic of 1918 sort of began and ended in 1918. And now that we've lived through a pandemic, we know there's not a sharp end to it, but it's kind of continuing. And when E.K. Warren gave the camp to the Congregational churches of Chicago, It was for the express purpose of providing a place of rest and recreation for both youth and pastors, clergy. So whether that was opportunities for youth to get out of the city, from some of these like really rough areas, or recognizing as we have the need we have for fresh air and being out in nature. It was out of those movements that Tower Hill Camp and Retreat Center was born.
Yeah, and we've said a couple of times that E.K. Warren did this, but in fact, he died in 1919. So
right. So it was actually
set up this foundation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. The E.K. Warren Foundation. This building is right at Tower Hill and Browntown Road. We have pictures of it where it's called the Beach House. And our campers, young people, families would come back from the beach past this building. And in this front porch area, they would stop and get ice cream. Could buy ice cream as they walked back down into the camp.
So at that point, it's the E.K. Warren Foundation, and this guy, Frederick Chamberlain, who's E.K.'s son-in-law, is running that foundation, and he's kind of the guy who pulls the levers to make this gift, right?
Exactly. And it's interesting. This was something I learned from you, Nick. Both E.K. Warren, do I have this right, and Chamberlain, both were children of congregational ministers out east whose fathers were strong abolitionists out east, so strong that they were kind of kicked out and invited to move along. And that's how they came into the Illinois, Michigan area.
Yeah, certainly E.K. Warren's father was. I think Chamberlain's was actually a professor of...
at Oberlin College.
Yeah, he was at Oberlin, right.
Right, which was a strong abolitionist school.
But the Congregational churches specifically thanked Frederick and his wife Lydia, who was E.K. Warren's daughter, for the gift of Tower Hill, as you can see there.
Yeah.
So this is 1923, right? When we're...
Right, 1923. So almost immediately, they began having youth conferences here where hundreds of young people would come. And this is a picture of one of those services that was out on the beach. And Linda, I think you'll notice quite a few hats in that picture. I always think it's funny. We have lots of pictures of beach services back in the 20s and 30s where the men and women are all dressed in wool suits, hats, etc.
Beachwear.
Beachwear, right.
So they actually dedicate the camp in 24.
In 24, correct. And that building that you can see in the background, that was originally part of the gift. That building burnt down. And so the oldest building we still have is Gammon Hall, which was built kind of just down the hill from that.
And Reverend Gammon was in fact the first director of the camp. So
exactly. And so it was actually during the Depression that Dr. Gammon challenged young people, especially in those Chicago churches, to begin collecting their quarters to raise money to build this new hall that ended up being named after him.
Mm-hmm. All right. And in the beginning, no cabins. Right?
In the beginning, no cabins. No, they had, they called them Tent City. And they had an area of Tent City for the boys and an area of Tent City for the girls. And those two areas that began as tents were later than, year-round buildings were put there, kind of concrete block. And both of those areas as concrete block summer cabins or summer bunkhouses for children and youth still exist.
Mm-hmm. And here's a neat picture of the drop-off that you can see all the suitcases there on the
hats.
Yeah, those fitting cloche kinds of hats are
right
in evidence.
Right.
Okay, and
yeah. more pictures here. We're, moving into the 30s, so you can see some of these buildings have been somewhat winterized or a little bit more solid than just the tents.
So there were things going on, not just in the summer, but year round?
Yes.
But the camps were in the summer, and then
it was primarily in the summer, but there were some family kinds of things that were happening a little bit later. Yeah, this is a really
from 49
cool picture, 1949. And I think what's really interesting to see is the diversity. That even in 1949, it was a place of a wide welcome, and children and youth from who were white, who were black. There are some where you can see Asian faces. That this is something that has always been a strong part of the character and the value that we continue to promote. Yeah, here you can see this is a picture of staff. And once again, you see that diversity in the staff.
Mm-hmm. And then you continue. Yeah. You're the only camp that we're featuring in this exhibit that's actually still in operation. So you're hitting your 100th year, right? I mean,
yeah. Last year was our 100th year. And can I tell that story, Nick, about the situation we had this past summer where this kind of idea of diversity and acceptance is still something that we really still care strongly about, and we still support. We had last summer, we had a situation where we had a large group of Mormon young boys and young men who were staying in one part of our camp. We had a large public school cross-country team staying in our campground, and we had a Myanmar refugee group of young people staying in another area. And at one point, the Mormon folks, they had reserved our whole play field. And when they found out the Myanmar kids were going to be here, they said, hey, even though we've reserved it, please tell all the Myanmar kids they can come over too. Like, there's room for all of us here. And then later on the next day, the cross-country kids had been out to the beach, and they were walking back about 10 o'clock at night, just laughing and joking around, not being obnoxious, just laughing and joking. And they realized that the Myanmar kids were in the middle of a worship service. And they came to me apologizing and said, gosh, we did not mean to interrupt what they were doing. Please apologize to them for us. And if you could find out their schedule, we'll adjust when we're coming and going so that we don't interfere or interrupt what they're doing. And so I think that's the kind of world we all want to live in, where people are welcoming and respectful and kind to one another.
Yeah. This is a wonderful description of the Campers' Day. We'll close with this. This is a guy who was there in the 50s and 60s. I think his father ran the camp then. Is that right?
Correct. It would begin with a morning meal, and then they would have crafts in Marshall Hall, which still exists. And then there would be kind of discussions, usually faith-based, led by a dean and the counselors, some free time with, hiking and sports, and then lunch, a rest period, which we still have, and then beach time. Afternoon is part of the E.K. Warren gift, in addition to the 60 acres here, was that 200 feet of beachfront. And so all of our campers head out to the beach and climb Tower Hill, and then come back for dinner, Vespers at Vesper Hill. So all of these things that he talks about of the typical day 40 years ago, that's been the typical day for probably about 100 years.
Okay. Well, we'll end on that note, and again, open it to any questions that might be forthcoming. If anybody wants to unmute and ask, that's good. And if not, congratulations on me. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Quickly, if I may, Nick.
Yeah.
Jack Sizer again. As she was speaking, I realized I'm a postcard collector. I was years ago, and I've collected many postcards since I grew up in the area of Sawyer in Harbert. I have 3 postcards here from a Tower Hill camp, and I would be happy to, rather than trying to do anything right now, I'll just send those along to Nick, and she can share them with Tracy. Or if you wish, I can put one up just so you can see what I'm talking about. Put one up and place one of my.
Yeah, I'd love to see it.
Hold it up over your face there. Yeah.
Just so good. Put one up.
Yeah, just hold one up in front of the camera there.
Okay. Now,
Oh, yep.
You have this one?
Yep. Well,
Okay.
I have a print of it, but we don't have the actual postcard.
Well, this is a postcard that wasn't sent. No postmark on it. This is another one of the just says where we eat.
Yep.
Oh yeah.
Yep. I love it.
Okay. And the other one, which is a little unusual, says hospital and dining hall from the playground, Tower Hill, Sawyer, Michigan. Here's that postcard.
Oh.
Ooh, I don't have that one at all.
Well, I will send it along to Nick, who can share it with you.
That'd be great. And Jack, I kind of have a question for you. When you
Yes.
talked about your time with the Sandbergs,
Yes.
my understanding is the end of our property, which we are the first beach south of Warren Dune State Park.
Yes.
The
Yes.
house at the top of the dune, we understand that that's the Sandberg cottage.
I have a picture of that also, if you'd like me to send that one too. I have a picture taken, and I don't know where it is. I can, rather than wait, take time right now, but I will get that to you also. But it's a picture taken from where the creek comes out, and it's looking up, and it identifies a small, low cottage as the Sandberg house.
Yep.
The Sandbergs rented that home for a number of years, built the cottage in Birchwood Beach, this big 3-story cottage, which I have pictures of course. That was built they bought the property in 1928 and were there until 1945. So before 1928, they had come out there regularly to Tower Hill Beach, and that rented that little picture that you had a picture of. But anyway, I will take any more time of this program, but I'll send them along to Nick, and I'll send that also a picture. Nick, I'm also going to send along a picture of the Swift house, which I have, which you'll enjoy. I understand you live right next door.
Thank you. Yes, I live on
Okay,
Swift.
Good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tracy. Enjoyed that so much.
I appreciate it. I'm going to take a really quick little break here now to do a little something about AI. Artificial intelligence is everybody's favorite topic of conversation these days, and we actually have an exhibit that makes use of a little AI. It's a program that corrects flaws and colorizes old photographs. So we did that with some of the photographs, the really nicest ones in our collections. This is Abner and Lucy Clark of Chickaming in 1863. And it's really amazing what a little color can do to a photograph. Really kind of brings it alive. This is the Payne Brothers Hotel in Galene. I don't know that those are all Payne Brothers. There were only 2 that owned the hotel, but I love it colorized as well. This is a Union Pier resort called the Idlewild that catered to Czech immigrants, Bohemians as they were called back then. And that's a little harvest scene that they put on. This is what US 12. This is US 12 going east out of Three Oaks. The building on the left is where the Dryers M60 Market was for a while, and that red barn is now a white barn, and it still says Oak Meadow Farm, and that of course was the Warrens farm east of Three Oaks. But you haven't seen M60 or US 12 as a dirt road anytime recently. And this is Dryer's Market itself. That's Ben Dryer behind the counter. And that's Ed Dryer's senior's daughter. I can't remember her name right now. Probably Debbie Weber can help me. And a customer whose name I believe was Snyder, but that's what Dryer's looked like back in 1921, I think that photo's from. And this is a group of veterans, members of the Grand Army of the Republic, which was essentially the American Legion for Civil War soldiers. And one interesting thing about this, you see some of the people are wearing pink and red hats. My theory is that when a photograph gets a little faded, the computer reads it wrong and puts it in as red instead of blue. So AI is not perfect, but they're working on it. And I do think that the color kind of adds something to some of these old photos. And we have different photos in our exhibit than these. And there's some really, the best ones are on exhibit. I just wanted to give you a taste of what that was looking like. And we do have, if anybody has any questions, happy to answer them. all of this is part of a broader display about photography. And the oldest camera in that display is something that is being lent to the museum by Teresa Savage. And the reason Teresa has it is that her great-great-grandmother, Susan Wagner Churchill, was a photographer using, we think, almost certainly using this camera. So Teresa, are you on now? You got audio?
Yes, I am.
Okay, super. Teresa's joining us from the eastern part of the state. Tell us a little about Susan Wagner Churchill and how she wound up in Three Oaks to begin with.
Well, she was born in Michigan and she got married in 1854 in Buchanan, Michigan. And Buchanan had a photography studio around 1859. And during her life and her husband's life, they were both photographers. So I imagine they were introduced to photography in Buchanan in the 1850s. And they both loved it. And for our family history says that Susan was the first known woman tintype photographer in the Midwest. And she did that in 1860 in Buchanan, Michigan. I believe around 1870, her and her husband were not getting along and they separated. So she, along with two daughters, moved to Three Oaks in 1870. And she started helping Frederick Warren in his studio. So what you saw the previous slide were some tintypes from my collection. And my favorite one's the middle one because it's a cat and I love cats. But these are pretty old tintypes. I think my great grandmother's pictures on the right. I have one that I think that's one's of Ida and this one is of Tina. So they were taking pictures in the late 1850s, early 1860s of their kids. And then her husband was a Buchanan photographer in 1860. But once she was in Three Oaks, she met Frederick Warren and she started working at the photography studio there. The picture of it is there on the left. And her daughters, Susan or Tina and Ida, also helped at the photography studio. And
this is Susan on the left, on the right hand on the left, right? The right hand,
yes,
left photo.
Yes,
and then
these are
daughters. Yeah.
Yeah. So on the left-hand side is Susan Churchill. Around the time she was helping Frederick Warren, she's the woman on the right. Her daughters, Tina, is in the middle, and then Ida, my great-grandmother, is on the right. So this is what they would have looked like in the 1870s, helping Frederick in the early 1870s.
Let me just add that Frederick at this point is dying of, I mean, he's going to die in 1875, and he's very weak throughout the 1870s. So probably the heavy lifting around the studio would have been done by these women largely, and there might have been somebody else involved, but they definitely were key to the operation.
And I'd like to add that Ida, during this time, the girl on the right, she did much of the mechanical work and news writing in Three Oaks' first paper, The Reveille. So she was involved in that. And so this is from the collection. Is this from your collection, Nick? The museum?
Yeah, this is a photo I found at Michigan State, but I'm virtually certain this is at Fred Warren's studio. Yeah.
And so this would have been the time period that Susan was working, and she most likely took this picture.
Yeah, yeah. And at the same time, they were taking these amazing pictures of Frontier Three Oaks. That's Elm Street. The studio, I just want to say, it was just north of the intersection with Maple Street. So about where the old car dealership, Lintner Chevrolet, is now. So that's looking down south toward the railroad tracks.
Yeah. The next slide. So this is Susan's tender report. It's a big, huge document that was made about Michigan's early photographers. And after Warren's death, Susan became the Three Oaks photographer. Our family history says that she ran the studio from 1875 until her death in 1918. This report here doesn't reflect that, but I know Ida continued to help her in the studio. Ida also got married during this time period. She married a farmer. She worked a farm. She raised 7 children, but also helped in the photography studio. And Tina became a school teacher.
and we think this is after 1900, because the railroad depot is there. This is kind of looking southwest, but this may well again have been something that she did, and maybe even her grandson, who by that at that point was helping, I think, right?
Yeah, he became, so we think that Susan took this picture here. It's about the time frame that she would have been taking pictures, from what the woman is wearing in the picture.
Very
I think it's
poetic.
a beautiful picture.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
Wow.
So in addition to photography, Susan also ran a boarding house between 1875 and 1918. Here she is in front of the boarding house at 106 Elm Street, which is right next to the photography studio. She made quilt tops for the boarding house. When the quilts became worn, a new top was attached, saving time for more filler and back. And Tina and Ida helped with the quilts. Many of these quilts survive today and are listed in quiltindex.org. And note, so we're thinking that the photography studio, the boarding house were very close to one another, and Susan spent her time going between one or the other.
And let me just add that we do have some of the quilt tops in the exhibit at the museum about Susan Churchill that we have for this year.
So this is a 3 generations picture taken around 1893. Susan's in the middle. Ida's on the right. Her husband's on the left. And Ida's son, Earl Savage, is the baby on Susan's lap. And this was the grandchild that Nick was talking about that later became a photographer in Three Oaks after World War I. Mm-hmm. Here's pictures. His name was Earl Savage. Here he is playing the fiddle. He played many instruments. And on the right is his World War I uniform. And as a side note, Earl married Ruth Votaw. I don't know if anybody there knows Votaws, but I'm related to them as well. Mm-hmm. So here's another 3 generations picture taken around 1908. Susan's in the center in the front row. Her kids, Tina and Ida, are sitting next to her. And in the back are Ida's kids. And Earl, my grandfather, has the arrow pointing at his head. So this would have been right before he became photographer, went to war, became photographer. Next slide. And here's pictures that he took of a parade, probably post-World War I in downtown Three Oaks.
Mm-hmm. And another couple of photos of him, and then a picture I think he took of his mother in the vegetable garden there.
Yes, yeah, that's Earl and Ruth Votaw after they were married, and then my great-grandma Ida.
And he went on to do other things professionally, but was a pretty avid just photographer, family photographer. These are some shots he took, right, of his kids.
Yeah. I don't know, the kid in the upper left, I don't know, that's an unknown person. But I just thought it was interesting to show all the buildings and whatnot that were in Three Oaks at the time.
Yeah. Terrific. Well, thank you. And let me, before we finish, right next to you is the chair from the photography studio, right?
Yeah. So this is a chair dated 1906. And it was in the Three Oaks photography studio. I have a picture of Ida sitting in the chair getting her picture taken. I have a picture of her husband Whitman and their daughter Ida sitting in the chair. So this chair got around in the early 1900s in Three Oaks.
And I will add that we would love to have that in the exhibit, but we just don't have room for it. So I did want people to be able to see it tonight. And again, if you have any questions for Teresa, this is a good time to unmute and ask them. If not, I will thank you, Teresa, very much for all your help putting together the exhibit as well as presenting tonight. And then I have a very brief one last item here. Another thing we're adding to our to displays. This, I don't know if anybody could tell what that is, but in fact, it's a beehive. And it is, in fact, the beehive. It's on loan from Michigan State. It was invented by E.K. Warren's father, Waters Warren. You heard Tracy talk about him a little bit. He was the firebrand abolitionist preacher who was his anti-slavery views kind of wore out his welcome in Vermont. So that's when he moved to Three Oaks, and that's why we have the Warrens here. And he got this patented in 1863. And here's an ad for it. You can see down at the bottom it says Waters Warren, Three Oaks, Michigan. There are some this is a picture that the aforementioned Fred Warren, the early photographer in Three Oaks, an ambrotype that he took of his father, displaying the beehive. And these are some of the drawings that were in the patent application. The advantages were said to be that it discouraged moths from infesting the hive, and that it kept the bees a little warmer in the winter, which I don't know about that claim specifically, but those are some of the drawings. And he did sell a few of them. This is a list. This is a typewritten copy of a handwritten list that was made of people that he sold them to. And there were some interesting names on there. There's William Chamberlain, was Henry Chamberlain's brother, who was also a merchant in town and partnered with his brother, and later became the warden of the state prison in Lansing. That was one of his pastimes later on. A couple of the Martins, both of them named Isaac. Big Martin family, everybody knows down on Martin Road is pretty well known. They bought some of these beehives. And Luther Sage, this is his picture when he was in the Union Army, but he also bought one, another Three Oaks fellow. So anyway, that beehive will be on display for 2 years. We have a 2-year loan from Michigan State, and I should thank them for letting us display that unusual artifact. But of course, it's kind of amazing that Waters Warren invented that, and it didn't really go anywhere. Then his son invents Featherbone and becomes a mogul, and his other son invents a calculating engine that's said to be 30 to 40 years ahead of its time. Doesn't make any money off of it because he dies. But that's a very inventive family. In any case, that is, if there are questions, I'm happy to handle them or try to answer. If there are not, I would just say thank you so much.
I have a question. This is Mike.
Sure.
I think these been able to sit on a few of these presentations. I think they're very informative. Is there any discussion of doing these year round? I know that this has sort of been a winter project, and you guys are concentrating on the museum in the summer. I think it'd be great to be able to do these year round.
Thank you. I do too. What we do in the summer, we generally do programs that people can attend live because they're easier to do live. And at some point, if my technical expertise gets better, we can figure out a way. We might even live stream some of those, but I got to confess, I don't really know how to do that. So for the summer, I think we're going to probably do programs live, but I do appreciate your comments about the first Thursdays, and we do plan on continuing to do those in the off season if we possibly can. Zoom is really allows us to, bring these kinds of programs to people who don't necessarily live that near Three Oaks. So, and a number of you attended a lot of these, and I really appreciate the regulars. And again, we're always interested in anybody's ideas of future subjects we could cover. So feel free to suggest.
Nick?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, just for Trace's information, I just found that picture of the Tower Hill camp. I don't know if you can see this.
Oh, yeah.
Way to show that. But the building, let me move this down a little bit. Oops.
Is that the Sandberg cottage you mean?
That's the Sandberg house, that's where the creek comes out. That's the postcard. Can you see the house?
Yeah, that's the one I thought.
Okay,
yeah.
I will send this. I will send this to Nick.
They did live there. They did rent that, and then when they decided to move up full time, they built the house in Birchwood.
Correct.
So that was kind of their first harbor house.
Correct. And they were looking for a place to be permanently, and so they built a 3-story home with the lookout, with the widow's walk on the top, down in Birchwood.
Thanks so much, Jack.
Oh, you're very welcome. Hey. Also, Nick, this is fantastic. This whole idea, what you're doing, is fantastic. As somebody that, in fact, when I created a Birchwood book that you may have looked at before, the Birchwood Summers. Many of the quotes that came out of that book were right from the Oaks, copies of the Oaks newspaper that were bound in the Three Oaks Museum library there. And we went and dug through those, and that was the basis of my book. Basically, it was all those details of what happened to Birchwood Beach and what a treasure that that collection of stories is because they had weekly reports from every little town in the area. And you could go in there and just find out who was going to visit somebody in Chicago, who had a baby in Three Oaks, who had whatever was going on in Sawyer, or Buchanan or Niles or whatever. It was fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Nick, very much for doing all this.
Well, thank you again for your assistance with this. And again, museum opens May 3rd, and members, you'll get an invitation to come the night before and check out all that's new at the museum. I hope everybody gathered here can come see some of these exhibits in person when we open. And thank you all for being here, and we'll bid you good night.
Night.
Thanks so much.